The original Battlestar Galactica television show was created by Glen A. Larson, aired for one season in 1978 to 79, and was subsequently canceled. ABC attempted a revival in 1980, but like its predecessor, it was quickly canceled as well. The fate of the Galactica franchise was further complicated by a lawsuit that was filed against Universal Studios, alleging ideas had been stolen from Star Wars. This resulted in a countersuit, which spun off into even more legal action, but we are not here to debate the legal proceedings. Today, we are here to discuss the original 1978 Battlestar Galactica and Galactica 1980. Creator Glen Larson drew inspiration for Battlestar Galactica from his Mormon background and his fascination with mythology, especially that of ancient Egypt. He used a Pearl Harbor-style attack to kick off the story, and what followed was a biblical exodus with a Western wagon train spin to find the lost colony of Earth. The pilot for the series, which was also a theatrically released film, begins with humans in a distant star system living in 12 colonies across 12 planets, preparing to sign a peace treaty with a race of robots called Cylons. The Cylons were named after the reptilian race that created them, but had died out 2,000 years earlier. The peace treaty was to end a war that had lasted 1,000 years. At the request of the Cylons, a human named Baltar, played by John Colicos, is brokering peace between the two groups, and the entire colonial fleet has come together in one place for the signing of the treaty. But the commander of the Battlestar Galactica, Commander Adama, played by Lorne Greene, is suspicious. He doesn't trust the Cylon desire for peace. Two of Adama's best Viper pilots are ordered to go on a reconnaissance patrol. Adama's son, Captain Apollo, played by Richard Hatch, and a pilot who is like a son, Lieutenant Starbuck, played by Dirk Benedict. Thinking that peace is at hand, Commander Adama's younger son, Zach, played by Rick Springfield, begs Starbuck to let him take Starbuck's place. Understanding Zach's eagerness to go on his first patrol, Starbuck feigns illness, allowing Zach to replace him. On patrol, Apollo and his brother Zach discover an approaching Cylon sneak attack. Communication has been jammed by the Cylons, and Apollo and Zach race back to the Galactica, with the Cylons close behind. Zach's Viper is damaged fighting the Cylons, which slows him down. Apollo leaves Zach and goes on ahead in order to warn the fleet of the impending attack. The Galactica knows that Apollo and Zach are under attack, but are unable to verify who is attacking. Commander Adama makes an appeal to the President for permission to launch intercept fighters. When Baltar steps in and advises against doing so for fear of upsetting the peace talks with the Cylons, the President denies Adama's request. Being a shrewd tactician and skilled politician himself, Adama decides it would be a good time for a battle stations drill, and has Colonel Ty, played by Terry Carter, sound the alert just before the Cylons attack. The President is in a state of disbelief, and Baltar appears to have abandoned him. But thanks to Adama's quick thinking, the Galactica is prepared and is the only Battlestar to survive the battle. Captain Apollo informs his father that the Cylon fighters were accompanied by refueling tankers, and not their usual base ship. Commander Adama realizes that the Cylons are waging a simultaneous attack against the colonies and rushes to protect his home colony of Caprica. But the Galactica arrives too late, and there is nothing left to do but collect those who survived. 220 ships are all that remains of the 12 colonies. With the President and the rest of the ruling council dead, Commander Adama makes the decision that the survivors will seek out the lost 13th colony of Earth. The fleet gets underway, and the expected shortages of things like food began to crop up. Apollo, Boomer, played by Herb Jefferson Jr., and Starbuck investigate. It isn't long before they discover a major source of the problem. A politician by the name of Sire Yuri, played by Ray Milland, is throwing lavish parties while people in the hold of his ship are starving. The redistribution of Sire Yuri's food only goes so far, and the fleet is in desperate need of supplies. Captain Apollo volunteers himself, Starbuck, and Boomer to clear a Cylon minefield in order to more quickly reach the planet of Carillon, where there is food and fuel. Apollo, Starbuck, and Boomer are successful in clearing a path for the other ships, and are surprised to find a resort and casino that no one has ever heard of, as well as an abundance of food and fuel on the planet. When Commander Adama discovers that Baltar had been responsible for the original survey of the planet, and had reported that there was too little fuel to justify mining, he suspects another Cylon trap. Meanwhile, Sire Yuri gives permission to half the fleet to visit Carillon, and they proceed to do so. People on the planet begin to lose track of time, some unable to recall how long they have been there, and find themselves in the planet's thrall, much like the Lotus Eaters Ulysses encountered in Homer's Odyssey. Sire Yuri has come up with the idea that if they destroy all their weapons, the Cylons will no longer see them as a threat and will leave them to live in peace. Adama disagrees. In order to push his agenda, Sire Yuri decides to give medals to Apollo, Starbuck, and Boomer for clearing the minefield and making a path for the fleet to reach Carillon. He expects all the warriors to be at the party, and Adama suspects Sire Yuri will use the opportunity to announce his disarmament plan. Smelling a trap, Commander Adama calls Colonel Tai to fill uniforms with mechanics, kitchen personnel, anyone, because Sire Yuri will only be counting uniforms, and if Adama is correct, Yuri won't be the only one. Meanwhile, Commander Adama and his warriors will be preparing for a Cylon attack. Just as Sire Yuri is announcing his plan to disarm, the Cylon attack comes, but Adama is ready, and beats back the attack. Apollo and Starbuck pursue the retreating Cylons in order to find their base ship. They manage to trick the Cylons into believing they are two squadrons rather than just two Vipers. Trying to hide from the squadrons, the Cylon base ship descends toward the surface of Carillon, unaware that during the fighting the extensive fuel deposits on the planet had been ignited. When the planet finally explodes, it takes the Cylon base ship with it. In the epilogue, the Cylons drag Baltar in front of the new Imperious leader, the previous having been destroyed by Apollo and Starbuck. The Imperious leader decides to spare Baltar's life so he can attempt to trick the humans into accepting another offer of peace. He gives Baltar his own base ship, and a Cylon by the name of Lucifer, voiced by Jonathan Harris, will be Baltar's second in command. In the theatrical release, Baltar died, but we're talking about the television series, so we're going with the Baltar Lives ending. The rest of the series follows the Galactica's pursuit of Earth. Battlestar Galactica only lasted one season, so we don't see the convoy reach Earth. However, when ABC attempted to rectify the stupidity of canceling the series with a new series called Galactica 1980, it's set some 30 years after the original series, and Earth has finally been found. Unfortunately, Galactica 1980 was more or less a cheap knockoff of the original. The only returning actors were Lorne Greene as Commander Adama, Herb Jefferson Jr. as now Colonel Boomer, and a guest appearance in the final episode by Dirk Benedict as Starbuck. The Galactica 1980 story revolved around Captain Troy, a grown-up version of the child Boxy from the original series, new character Lieutenant Dylan, and a group of creepy kids sent from the Galactica to live on Earth. This series only lasted 10 episodes, and with good reason. It was an incredibly dumbed-down shadow of the original. Troy and Dylan somehow managed to be dumber than the kids they brought to Earth with them, and the Galactica was now under guidance of a super genius child, played by two different actors in just 10 episodes. This was a far cry from the intelligent stories and characters we had watched when the franchise initially began. The original Battlestar Galactica story did, however, continue in the form of novels. 15 books were published between 1978 and 1987. Between 1997 and 2005, Richard Hatch partnered with other authors to publish several more novels set in the original continuity. Books from the reboot also exist, but we won't be discussing those here. In 1998, Richard Hatch made an attempt at making a film called Battlestar Galactica: The Second Coming. The story would have been in the continuity of the original series. Hatch mortgaged his own house to pay for the pilot film, which had a 30-minute running length. Unfortunately, Universal chose to go with a reboot instead. A 4-minute trailer for the film does exist, and can be found on YouTube, but the pilot film has never been publicly released. At around the same time as Hatch's proposal, Glen Larson pitched an idea of his own. He wanted to make a feature film centered on the Battlestar Pegasus, and what happened after the Pegasus appeared on Battlestar Galactica. This project was also not meant to be. Richard Hatch was initially not happy with the reboot, but changed his mind and had a regular role on the new series. Glen Larson never publicly made any derisive comments about the reimagining done by Ronald D. Moore, But Dirk Benedict did not hold anything back concerning his thoughts on Moore's reboot. In 2006, Benedict posted a statement on his website, originally published in Dreamwatch magazine in May 2004, titled Lost in Castration, which can still be found using the Internet Archive Wayback Machine. In his statement, Benedict talked about how he, in the 1970s, had to fight the executives in order to make Starbuck the lovable rogue we all know and love. He said Glen Larson was routinely threatened with one more cigar and he's fired. The suits insisted that women were turned off by men who smoked cigars, and Starbuck's perpetual flirting was treating women like sex objects. Fortunately, Dirk Benedict prevailed, because female fans couldn't get enough of the blatantly heterosexual Starbuck, sending Benedict boxes of cigars, phone numbers, dinner requests, and even marriage proposals. Benedict went on to state that after Battlestar Galactica was canceled, Starbuck managed to live on. He just changed his name to Templeton Peck, also known as Faceman, and joined the A-Team. I won't go too far into Dirk Benedict's thoughts on Ronald D. Moore's version of Battlestar Galactica, but Benedict makes it clear in his statement that he was not pleased that a television show based on hope, spiritual faith, and family was unimagined and regurgitated as a show of despair, sexual violence, and familial dysfunction. For anyone who wants to read Benedict's statement, I'll put a link to the Internet Archive in the description of this video. I'm also considering making a video just about Lost in Castration at some point in the future, so if that's something you'd like me to cover, let me know in the comments. And that pretty much wraps up the background on Glen Larson's Battlestar Galactica, so we will now commence with the conversation.
Well, I know you just said that you weren't planning on talking a lot about the Ronald D. Moore reboot, but it's going to be kind of hard not to, especially when making comparisons about what this series was versus what it was turned into. A couple of years ago, we did do a review of the miniseries of the 2003 Battlestar Galactica, which was mostly positive, and we did recommend the miniseries, even though the proper series we could not recommend. And I do believe we still hold to that. But there were lots of things that we bit our tongue on when we did that review, because we didn't feel at that time it was right to make the conversation go in that direction, because we hadn't talked about the original series yet. But now we're talking about the original series, so I think it's fair game to make some commentary. The first question that I have is Ronald D. Moore's Galactica. That was hailed as some sort of breakthrough in representation. How? Lieutenant Boomer, black male. Colonel Ty, black male. Removed. Lieutenant Boomer in the 2003 Galactica was now an Asian woman. Colonel Ty in the 2003 Galactica was a drunk white male. How is that moving anything forward? In fact, can anybody name me any black male characters in the 2003 Battlestar Galactica? There were two in the original. Two major characters, too, not just side characters. Boomer became almost at the same level as Starbuck with Apollo. And Colonel Ty was second in command of the Battlestar Galactica. Removed. How is that progress? They removed Adama's daughter, Athena, and replaced her with, I suppose, surrogate Starbuck, who is now female in the 2003 Galactica. How? How is that a step forward? In the 2003 Galactica, Zach ended up dying because he wasn't really a very good pilot. In the original Battlestar Galactica, Zach died because he was inexperienced. He was a good pilot from all measures. He just was on his first mission, and they were not anticipating wave after wave of Cylons to have to fight off. Even an experienced pilot like Apollo, his brother, was having difficulties with the Cylons. So they took Zach and they made him this washout loser in the 2003 Galactica. Again, I ask, how is this a step forward? Later on in the series, we were introduced to Commander Kane, who I will talk about in a little bit. But he had a daughter named Sheba, who was an exceptional Viper pilot. Where was Sheba in the 2003 Galactica? There were so many characters that were either mutilated in the reboot in a character assassination, or just completely left out. For instance, Jolly, who was part of the Viper Squad, he appeared very, very, very briefly in the Galactica 2003 miniseries as a name thrown about when the Viper Squad first encountered the Cylons who were disabling equipment, and that whole squadron was completely killed off very quickly. I have lots of negative things to say in regards to the 2003 Galactica and the character assassination that they did to multiple characters. But I'm going to try to spend some time talking about some positive things, but I am going to swing back around to talk about specifically Commander Kane. That's one of my major ones that I'm going to spend a bit of time on, what they did with the original versus what they gave us in the reboot. Now, I did not care for the 1980 Battlestar Galactica. If you want to call it a season 2, fine, but it was a separate series.
Galactica 1980.
That was in my opinion, a horrible piece of junk, and I would not recommend anybody watch that unless you want to laugh really, really, really hard. They had Lauren Green, who played Adama, wearing what looks like a glued-on beard, and it looks stupid. Dr. Z, I can't even begin to describe what that was.
That was that child prodigy that was now in charge of the entire group. That one I never understood why they would do that or what even precipitated that. And then the kid was played by 2 different actors. That was a mess.
And Boxy, the Boxy that's in the 1978 first season of Battlestar Galactica, Serena's son, Apollo's stepson. Captain Troy in the 1980s Galactica was supposed to be Boxy from the first season. How a grown adult character could be stupider than what, an 8-year-old, a 10-year-old child? No idea. The first thing I want to mention that I did enjoy quite a bit was, even though it was 1978 technology, the visual effects, the sets, and the spaceship scenes were extremely well done for a 1978 television show. I mean, extremely well done. The Battle of Simtar, which was the battle that happened for the colonies that fell, that was extremely well done. And I would recommend, like I did with the miniseries when I said you should go to YouTube and look for the battle at Ragnar Anchorage, for seeing some extremely well done visual effects in the rebooted Galactica. I would recommend you look up Battle of Simtar, Cimtar, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, as the battle that would be equivalent to the Ragnar Anchorage type battle, except this was the one where the colonies actually fell. And 1978's technology, and that's what they did. And I would also recommend watch the Blu-ray of this. Do not watch the DVD of this, because the Blu-ray adds such fidelity to what the visuals are that you can really appreciate the meticulous nature of the sets. And to even be more specific, there are 2 Blu-ray versions floating around out there. One is called the remastered version. That's the lesser version. That's the version that has the cropped 16:9 format. What you want is the definitive edition, and that has both the 16:9 and the original 4:3. And I would recommend watching the 4:3 if you watch this series, because one could go into a longer discussion about artistic purity, but what it boils down to is I think whoever did the cropping in the 16:9, I don't think they did an excellent job at it. And I think you're missing important pieces of the picture, specifically on the top, but sometimes on the bottom. So if you know what I'm talking about, then I shouldn't need to explain any more. But you want the square-looking image, not the rectangle-looking image. And yes, I know on your phone or TV you're going to have black bars on the side, but you're actually going to see more of the picture if you watch it in the 4:3 ratio. So that's my recommendation. For me, I look at this series as having some filler episodes. Only 9 I consider to be must-watch, but I'm sure old schoolers in the comments will argue with me and go, no, there's more than 9, you must watch them all. The first 3 is the 3-part pilot, I believe called Saga of a Star World. And then the next is a 2-part installment called Lost Planet of the Gods. And then the next 2 is The Living Legend, which is my favorite of the bunch. And then the final one I recommend is War of the Gods, which was also a 2-parter, which I consider to be a sequel of sorts to The Living Legend. And I would recommend watching those episodes. If you watch nothing else, watch those 9 episodes, and I think you'd get a good handle on what Battlestar Galactica 1978 was all about. Going back to that Dirk Benedict article that he wrote, what was his general opinion of what they did?
Oh, he hated what they did. I mean, absolutely hated it. That came through very clearly in his statement, Lost in Castration. It basically was talking about how they were gender swapping all of these characters and essentially stripping them of what they were. I don't disagree. I actually agreed with nearly everything that he had to say, because this feels like, to me, it feels like Ronald D. Moore's reboot of Battlestar Galactica is ground zero for all this gender swapping we've been seeing for almost 25 years now. And I think that that was a terrible thing to do, because so many other franchises, not only did they take that naturalistic science fiction that Ronald D. Moore pioneered, I guess, that idea, not only did other shows adopt that idea as the way to go, basically setting the standard for current science fiction television, but they also adopted that gender swapping stuff, even the race swapping stuff too, because you see what they did with Colonel Ty and with Boomer. They essentially eliminated all the black males from the show, which I still don't quite comprehend. But then again, this was, I would say, proto-woke. This was the original test, I think, of doing that. And unfortunately, it was received really well by a lot of people. Those of us who like the original Battlestar Galactica recognize that your sex is an inherent part of who you are, and it's an immutable fact, the meat stack that you're stuck in. I don't agree with those people who think this was a good idea. It was terrible, because it destroyed those characters. They weren't the same character anymore. They just slapped the name on there. I think a lot of that had to do with just the fact that they wanted to be able to make Galactica in their image. I think that, honestly, I've read that Ronald D. Moore is an agnostic. I don't think that he respected the faith that was the basis for the original Battlestar Galactica. And I think that's what led to what he did with the diminishing of what the original really was. And Dirk Benedict touched on that a little bit with the complaints that he had about them destroying what was a hopeful franchise and instead loading it down with a bunch of sexual violence, just interpersonal conflict, and just dysfunctional families. And he was very right about that, because that's what it looks like to me. Just a complete bastardization of what the original was.
You look at those character swaps that they did. Boomer was a competent Viper pilot who was kind of the straight man of the trio of Apollo, Starbuck, and himself. A lot of times Starbuck would drag him into situations and Boomer would have to just try to deal with it. But that was a good character. That was an actual good character. He was the one that exposed the hoarding of food in the pilot. In fact, when a security guard was trying to keep him out, Boomer's the one that pulled his sidearm out and said, "Move aside, we're going to see what's going on in here." And then Colonel Ty, they replace a competent black leader with a drunk white male who eventually turns out to be a Cylon. And I'm pointing this out because both Boomer and Ty are probably some of the best black male characters I've seen in the science fiction genre ever. And they were stripped out, lessened. Boomer turned out to be an Asian woman who also was a Cylon, I don't understand. They got no flack for doing this. Everybody concentrated on, well, Starbuck going from male to female, which I have problems with that too, but everybody concentrated on that, and nobody concentrated on completely erasing two very good black male characters. Leaders. How did Ronald D. Moore not get flack for this? Or did he? I just didn't see it. But everybody talked about the Starbucks swap, but nobody seemed to care about Boomer and Ty being not only swapped like they did, but then their characters like just dragged through the mud.
Well, and also don't forget that they eliminated Athena, they eliminated Serena, they eliminated Sheba, they eliminated Cassiopeia. So there were all of these women who were no longer in the show. I think he used the Athena name later, Ronald D. Moore did, for yet another Boomer version of the Cylon. Aside from that, there were several female characters who appeared in the 1978 version.
Regulars, not just one-offs.
Yes, they were regular main characters in the show, and yeah, they were eliminated. I'm so tired of seeing people say, oh, well, you know, before, what was that Jennifer Lawrence, that women, they didn't have strong roles in science fiction, and it's like, what the hell are you talking about? Here's an example from 1978 where there were several strong female characters who weren't Mary Sue's, by the way, and in the reboot, they just got rid of them. Gone. Just gone. They went even worse than what happened with Boomer and Colonel Ty, because those characters were race swapped, Starbuck was gender swapped, but the rest of those women, they were just eliminated. Just gone. How is that progressive? I don't understand. Like you said, I think people are so focused on the gender swap that they did with Starbuck that people didn't realize just the seriousness of what was done there. Just how devastating it was to the original lore, what Ronald D. Moore was doing to that show.
You mentioned a few minutes ago how you kind of saw this as proto-woke, and I look at what they did with the Galactica 2003, and I see a lot of the problems that we're dealing with now. For instance, the idea of Easter eggs, where in the 2003 Galactica miniseries, they played the Stu Phillips theme while the museum ship was being decommissioned. And that was supposed to be a wink-wink to the audience that was of the previous 1970s Galactica. Well, here's something I didn't really pay attention to until we rewatched Battlestar Galactica a few years ago. But 6, the Cylon that Baltar saw in his head and had the affair with, that red dress she was in for a lot of that. I'm guessing that was an Easter egg when they first picked up Cassiopeia after the colonies fell, because she was in a very similar red dress and she was also a blonde. Easter egg. I guess we were supposed to just be grateful and clap like seals that they got that in there. I say this because both in Star Trek and in Doctor Who, there seems to be, they stick some of the iconography in there, and you're supposed to be happy as an older fan. Be happy with the iconography and shut up. So even though Cassiopeia was not in this, a red dress blonde was in it, so we should just be happy. And I'm not happy with that. I'm not happy with that at all.
Well, especially since in the original Cassiopeia started out as a social leader, which was basically a high-class call girl. She retrained to be a med tech. In the original series, she would go on missions and she actually saved lives, risking her own. That was a really good character arc. It really was. And then, so what did they do with the 2003 reboot? Well, they use her red dress and her blonde hair. She's a slutty Cylon in Baltar's head. Ew.
I guess because Ronald D. Moore saw Cassiopeia as that high-end prostitute. I mean, I would more think of it's like Cassiopeia was more like, because they portrayed it in the narrative like it was a respected profession. So kind of like a companion from Firefly. I think that's what Cassiopeia was supposed to be. But Ronald D. Moore just turned that type of imagery into some, yeah, like you said, some slutty blonde in a red dress.
Yeah.
That was Cassiopeia right there. That was a more indirect smearing, but that's how I took it anyway.
Instead of the well-trained, learned courtesan that she was, yeah, he just turned her into something gross.
I realize we haven't talked much about the 1978's Galactica yet, because the Ronald D. Moore stuff just, in comparison, really rubbed me the wrong way. I was going to say this toward the end. Can we get into the Kane stuff, get it out of the way, then maybe we can circle around and talk about some of the positives?
Well, maybe we should start with talking about Commander Adama, because I think it's important to understand who he was in the original, so we know how he and Kane actually interacted with each other. So, Commander Adama in the original, he wasn't just a military man, he was a politician as well. And he became the de facto president of the, I guess, wagon train of survivors after the colonies fell and the president was killed. He was not only in charge of everyone, he acted like a father to everyone. He answered to the Council of 12, but...
He was a member of the Council of 12, at least I thought he was.
Yes, he was. So he was a politician before all of this stuff even went down, as well as being the person in charge of the Galactica. And he came across like a father figure. He always tried to have the best interest of his people in mind. He didn't have a President Roslin telling him the war is over, we have to go find some place to hide and have babies. He himself was the one that said, you know what, we're going to go find Earth. He was a believer.
He did have that conversation in the 70s Galactica, but that same conversation happened between himself and Commander Kane. That same conversation, he was in the Roslin role and Commander Kane was in the Adama role.
Exactly. So, yeah, so now that you understand what Adama was, now I think we can talk about Commander Kane.
Well, let's one last thing about the original Adama. So, the original Adama was that political leader and he was a military leader. And what they did in the reboot is they split out his character. The political part of Adama got put into Roslin. And all that was left was a military leader with a little bit of ethics. I mean, he talked about that law background once in a while in the reboot. But all the leadership wisdom that 1970s Adama had was stripped out and replaced by Roslin. So whenever you see Roslin in the 2003 Battlestar Galactica, in the 1970s Galactica, that would have been Adama talking about that stuff. Am I okay with that split? I don't know. You could argue that's another gender flip they did. They created a new character, took out part of Adama's character, and put it into a female character. That one's not as overt as Boomer or Ty or Starbuck, but it's still one of those things that happened that I would argue is a gender flip.
Which admittedly, in the original, the Council of 12 didn't have any women on it initially. So I can see why you would want to update that.
Why not just have a character without stripping Adama of his membership on that council?
Completely agree. Yeah, I think stripping part of Adama's personality out of him, it made him less of a three-dimensional character after that, because they did remove a big part of who he was in the original. And I would say that's largely because Ronald D. Moore needed to do that, because he wanted Adama to be that military guy. Well, that's something to talk about later.
I'm not trying to claim that Edward James Olmos's Adama character was just some brainless jarhead. He had some intellect to him, some thoughtfulness, but not like Lauren Green's Adama. Not to the level where you would expect him to be on a ruling council of a civilization. Adama, he was a pretty badass character, so I'm not trying to take anything away from that portrayal. That was actually one of the highlights of that series, was Olmos's Adama character. But it wasn't the same as Lauren Green's Adama character. So yeah, can we...
Yes, let's talk about Commander Kane.
So, Kane in the 2003 Galactica was a female. In the original, a male, of course. In the 2003 Galactica, Helena Kane was a piece of human garbage.
And an admiral.
And an admiral, so she outranked Adama.
Whereas in the original, Commander Kane did not outrank Adama.
In the original, Commander Kane was explained by several people in narrative as like this once-in-a-generation tactical genius, possibly of all time. So people listened to him not because he had a strong personality, which he did, but because people knew that he was that good at what he did. Whereas Helena Kane, they even mentioned when they first found the Pegasus, there was some rumors rumbling in the background in dialogue. She was a young hotshot that was on the fast track, blah, blah, blah. There was an implication there that maybe she wasn't qualified to be at that position of Rear Admiral that she was at. And based on the decisions that she made in the 2003 Galactica, that would sort of back that up, because she was a piece of human garbage. Like, I don't know a nicer way to put it. That's a huge smear over what was in the 70s Galactica.
She was a war criminal.
Yeah. Because one of the things that stood out to me as a difference was in the 70s Galactica, Kane was explaining to Adama how when the Fifth Fleet was destroyed and only the Pegasus remained, that he picked up as many people as he could carry on his ship. Whereas in the 2003 rebooted Galactica, Helena Kane, she stripped whatever ships were left of all their technology, took whatever people she thought was helpful, and just left the rest to kind of die at the hands of the Cylons. If that's not a character smear of somebody, along with changing a competent military leader into a piece of garbage, I don't know what counts as smearing.
And she was a lesbian.
Yeah, then we found out if you watched the Razor movie, which was supposed to be a prequel explaining what happened with the Pegasus in the 2003 Galactica, and you found out that that Cylon that she had captured was actually her lover.
A number 6.
Yep, a blonde number 6 that Helena Kane felt betrayed by, and that's why she gave the extra oomph to the torturing. That goes back to the 1970s portrayal, because The Living Legend, that is the two-parter where Commander Kane is in that. That's my favorite episode of the series, followed closely by the 3-part pilot. And the way Lloyd Bridges played Kane, he played him like an overbearing, but a hero, somebody you can see why his people followed him. Because what I liked about him is where Adama had to take care of all of those civilian ships, so he was more guerrilla warfare, hiding, getting whatever resources he could to keep the fleet moving. Commander Kane was not like that at all. He, ever since they lost that battle, he has been actively fighting the Cylons and beating on this one base to steal fuel from them. And his pilots were surprised that the Galactica's pilots weren't more aggressive with what they were doing, because it just seemed like that's what you're supposed to do, is just kick the Cylons from one side to the other. And Helena Kane had some of that. I'm not going to say she didn't. But there was also a part of the original Kane two-parter, The Living Legend, where Kane and Adama were debating back and forth about tactics. And Adama relieved Kane of duty. And then Kane was down in the bar, drowning his sorrows and licking his wounds in that political battle that he lost. And his daughter and Bojay came down, and they were implying that, we'll do whatever you want, sir. And they were implying they would mutiny. And when Kane sniffed that out, he wanted nothing to do with that. He said something like, I may be the most arrogant warrior in the history of the colonial fleet, but I'm also the best warrior in the history of the colonial fleet, and I'm not going to let a bunch of civilians die at the hands of Cylons. Helena Kane would never do that.
No, she killed a bunch of civilians.
And then at the end, I mean, I liked the Kane character in the original Living Legend, because there was a plan at the end where they were hitting that fuel depot. The sort of agreed upon plan that Adama thought the plan was Kane and his Battlestar was going to delay the base ships while the Galactica took care of the fuel depot. But that wasn't Kane's plan, and Kane knew that wasn't what was going to happen. Kane decided that he was going to take on all three of those base ships as he was making a beeline right toward Baltar, who was on one of the base ships. And when Baltar figured out what Kane was doing, he was panicking, and there were two other base ships. And Baltar's like, let those two engage the Pegasus. We're going to fall back because this guy wants me. He wants me. Again, because Baltar betrayed the colonies and caused the fall of the colonies. And when Kane, throughout that entire ending exchange, where you could see that he was like, I'm going to have one last battle in me, and I'm going to give them a battle for the ages. He even asked for Adama's approval, because right when Adama figured out what he was doing, Adama said, well, you understand, I could relieve you of duty again. And Kane was like, well, don't make my last act be an act of mutiny. Send me with your blessing. And then Adama gave it. So that was a perfect end to that whole arc where, you have somebody like that and you send him loose on your enemy. And normally you don't like those tactics, but in this one case, it's give him hell, buddy. That whole two-parter story was fantastic. And then I think that led into the War of the Gods. But I'm going to wait till we're done with this end, because I've got a bunch of speculation of things that was never stated in these episodes, but the old man kind of put some pieces together of his own, and I want to say that because there could be debate to be had or spoilers to be given, so I'll wait a little bit longer. But going back to what they did with the Kane character in Galactica Reboot, Ronald D. Moore, I would argue that was probably one of the biggest in-your-face smears of how little Ronald D. Moore thought of the source material. And this reminds me of what Alex Kurtzman does to Star Trek. Look what he did to Spock. Look at Spock on Strange New Worlds. He's the butt of jokes. Like, constantly the butt of jokes. Like Sheldon on The Big Bang Theory. That's Spock. Spock also has a learning disability. Remember, Michael Burnham was helping him with that in Discovery. It's the same type of thing that they did with this Kane character. Kane was the most badass military leader the colonies ever saw. Look what they did to him. They turned him into a female and then made that female a huge piece of garbage, explaining away, well, when you're under major duress like that, you never know what human beings will devolve into. And my personal philosophy is, no, that's when you see what human beings are made out of when they're under that sort of duress. Anybody can pretend to be a good person when everything's going fine. It's only when you're really devolved into chaos that you see what human beings are. And the 1970s Galactica, going back to what you were saying, what Larson and Dirk Benedict were kind of saying, is this used to be a story of a tragedy that happened, but a very hopeful, everybody bond together and work together to get us out of this. And then you see this post 9/11 deconstruction crap that Ronald D. Moore did, where all of these people toward the end, all these characters, they ruined. In the miniseries, I liked a lot of the characters in the 2003 Galactica. By the end, I don't know if I liked any of them. And they called it character growth, but almost every one of these characters did something horrible. And I mean not a little bit horrible, but like a lot horrible.
Makes you kind of wonder what Ronald D. Moore does in his own spare time.
And then when people were like, man, Ronald D. Moore, he should be in charge of Star Trek next. Nah, I mean, maybe after watching some of the Star Trek stuff that he did in the 90s, like maybe I'd be open to listening. But after seeing what he did with Galactica, no. Look what he did to Galactica. Look what he did to Kane, Boomer, Ty, all the rest we've talked about. You don't think he wouldn't do that again with Star Trek?
No, in a heartbeat.
Yeah, but he worked on Star Trek before. That's not going to stop him.
Look what Russell Davies just did. Yeah. See Doctor Who.
He used to work on it too.
Sure did. He brought it to the height of what it ever was, with over 10 million viewers an episode. And now look where it is. Less than 2 million in some instances. Around 2 million, we'll say, per episode. Yeah.
Because what I don't understand, now that we talked about the Kane character a little bit, In the 70s Galactica, he had a daughter, Sheba, played by Anne Lockhart, who was the real-life daughter of June Lockhart, who played Maureen in the original Lost in Space. And she was a very good pilot. In fact, when she encountered, her and Bojay encountered Apollo and Starbuck, since they were seasoned by attacking those Cylons constantly, they were out flying Starbuck and Apollo. Sheba was a really good pilot. So why didn't Ronald D. Moore just take the Sheba character and make that the center female pilot instead of making Starbuck a female pilot? Why would you do that? You had, in 1978, you had exactly the character you wanted. You had a kick-ass female Viper pilot. In 1978!
Well, he knew Starbuck was basically the star, and he wanted that to be a woman. Like I said, I think this is ground zero for that gender swapping crap. So even though Sheba already existed and would have made an excellent character to be used again.
And be loyal to the 70s series, because you want to make her a badass Viper pilot, you don't have to do anything different. She already was that.
Yeah.
Her father was Kane. We've already talked about Kane. Kane made sure his daughter could hold her own against anybody.
Yep. Yeah.
I don't understand why Athena was written out of the story like she was. I'm not saying Athena was a major character in the 70s Galactica, but she was on the bridge an awful lot. She had speaking lines. I think she ran the tactical station. And she was a shuttle pilot because in Lost Planet of the Gods, she had to be retrained to be a Viper pilot. So they could have done something with Athena. Even though her part was limited in the original, she still was a really good character. She ran a bridge station. She was very competent at what she did. So why remove that character? Unless I'm missing it, but I think the only Athena that was in the show is what Molly mentioned. One of those boomer permutations was taking the name of Athena, and that was more of a gods type name, not homage to the Athena character that was in the original Battlestar Galactica. And then Serena, why was that written out completely? That was the love interest of Apollo.
Because Starbuck was the new love interest of Apollo.
Well, along with the brother, so there was this weird triangle going on there.
Well, I think, like I said, Ronald D. Moore, I think he wanted to up the drama, up the tension, and the way to do that was, making Zach basically a victim of his own incompetence as well as people pushing him through. And then Apollo blaming his father for his brother's death because of the strings he pulled. And then, of course, Apollo hating Starbuck and himself because he was attracted to Starbuck, who was Zach's fiancée. And people say he wanted to take the opera out of space opera. Ronald D. Moore actually amped that up to an 11.
The rebooted Galactica had so much pointless drama in it. It just reminds me of that rumor that was floating around in the early 90s, I think it was, of how Gene Roddenberry would shackle the writer's hands by not being able to write personal conflict. And I don't think that was the rule anyway. I think it was he didn't want the Starfleet people squabbling over stupid stuff. But there was this rumor put out there about Roddenberry just stopping people from writing any sort of useful drama. And I start to wonder if Ronald D. Moore was one of those writers that was pushing that after Gene Roddenberry died, because Roddenberry wasn't there to defend himself anymore. And then you see what Ronald D. Moore did with this rebooted Galactica, and all it is interpersonal crap. To the point where if somebody made a compilation of episodes where they took all the useless interpersonal stuff out and just gave you the meat of what you want to watch here, maybe I'd be open to watching this. I don't know, the rebooted Galactica series, because the miniseries is pretty much the only thing I can tolerate. We watched that Razor movie a couple of days ago, and oh my God, that took forever to get through. It was so boring and pointless. That was a story we didn't need to know, because it didn't really add anything other than the Cylon was a lover of Kane's. Everything else was basically stated in those 3 episodes of the regular series of the rebooted Galactica where they found the Pegasus.
Yeah.
Because I think the 3 episodes were called Pegasus, and then I think there was a 2-parter right after that called The Resurrection Ship. I think it was part 1 and 2. That was the 3 episodes that had Kane in it. And in the end, here comes a spoiler, in the rebooted Galactica, the Cylon picks up a gun and shoots Helena Kane right in the head and kills her.
Woohoo!
Yeah.
Couldn't have happened to a nastier person.
I just don't understand how we've gotten to this point in our entertainment where this series is actually one of the best series ever to have female representation, to have minority representation. You had 2 black males in very prominent roles. You had Athena, you had Serena, you had Cassiopeia, you had Sheba, you had Rigel, who was the lady who was the one who said, launching Vipers. She was the one that talked to the cockpit. I guess she was the tower. There were lots of females that they could have built on. Yeah, in the original, like, Rigel wasn't really developed all that much. But in the reboot, they could have given her, was it D? Was the kind of a similar type character in Galactica? Why create D? Why not just make Rigel 2.0 in the reboot? Why make a new character? I don't understand. Why make Hilo when you had Jolly? Why do that? Not that Hilo was a bad character, but why make a new character when you haven't used all the characters that were in the original anyway?
Well, especially if you were going to just change the ones you kept. Like, what was the point of adding new names if nobody was going to be the same character anyway?
Well, and that comes down to, I guess we didn't mention this, but in the original series, and again, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, maybe a book fleshed this out, but in the original series, I'm pretty sure those names, Apollo, that was Apollo's real name, not his Top Gun call sign like it was in the rebooted Galactica. Because I think Leodama was the rebooted Galactica, Apollo's name.
Yeah.
But I believe Apollo was his actual real name, and Starbuck was his real name. So they removed that as well. They took out those names and just made them call signs because I guess people wouldn't accept having those sorts of names, even though they're a different civilization. I don't know. That one didn't bother me as much. It's just, it took me out of it a bit when they started coming up with different names, like Kara Thrace for Starbuck. It's like, not Starbuck. Like, why are you doing Kara Thrace? I guess because normies wouldn't put up, because that's what I think that boils down to. They wanted to make a mainstream action series with a sci-fi veneer, so you couldn't have somebody called Starbuck and just keep calling him that in dramatic scenes. So they gave that person a real name. That's my personal take, but I don't know for sure. I mentioned that Sheba was, in real life, Anne Lockhart was June Lockhart's daughter, and June Lockhart played Maureen Robinson in the 60s Lost in Space. Well, the voice of Lucifer, Baltar's, I guess, second in command, was voiced by Jonathan Harris, and Jonathan Harris was Dr. Smith from the original Lost in Space. So there was a little Lost in Space connection there, whether we knew it or not. And that was an interesting piece of trivia that I didn't know Anne Lockhart was June Lockhart's daughter until much later after the show got off the air, and I figured that one out. And I'm not claiming the 70s Galactica was all great stuff. Like, there are episodes like The Lost Patrol where Starbuck was testing this experimental ship and he landed on this like bootleg planet with Cylons, and I didn't care for that. The Young Lords was like this Viking planet that I didn't care for that. There are several of those that I just didn't care for. But the 9 episodes I mentioned, I think hold up to anything rebooted Galactica ever did. As I said, catch it on Blu-ray and watch it in the 4:3 ratio. Also, for the pilot, I'm going to recommend, even though you can only get the theatrical release in 16:9, don't initially watch the theatrical release, because I would offer, that's a lesser version of the story that began the whole thing. I would recommend watching Saga of a Star World, the 3-part TV. There's extra scenes in there. They're put in a different order. And Baltar does survive at the end because in the theatrical release, the Imperious leader, after Baltar's done his job, he says, well, all humans must die or something like that, and I don't trust anybody who would turn on his own people. And then he has a Centurion. It's implied that he gets his head chopped off. My recommendation there is, if you haven't watched this before but you want to try it, don't watch the theatrical release. Watch the 3-part Saga of a Star World in the 4:3 ratio. I think you'll have a much, much better time. And another interesting thing about the series in the 70s is they kind of gave you what I used to call as a kid, like metric time. So they made up their own units of time, and you kind of had to guess what they meant. They sounded similar to what you could figure out. Like, Kane and the Pegasus disappeared 2 Yarans ago. The Battle of Molokai, I think, was the name of the battle where the Pegasus initially disappeared, and that was 2 Yarans ago, and I think we're supposed to assume... Initially, I thought it was years, but then we were kind of lining up some stuff, and we thought maybe a Yaran might be like 6 months in real time.
Yeah, because at one point, it's pointed out that Adama is not an old man, because the expected lifespan is 200 Yarans, so he was about middle-aged. If they have the same kind of lifespan as a human does, we just assume that, well, it's 100 years. So then perhaps a Yaran is 6 months.
And they had units like centons that they use constantly in the show. I have no idea what those actually mean. Feel free in the comments if you have a better conversion of these, what I call metric time. Feel free to put them in the comments below. But when you watch it, you'll notice that you get these odd times. And you'll also notice that despite what people think, Ronald D. Moore's Galactica did not invent the profanity of frack. That was done in the 70s Battlestar Galactica. There was also some other slang that they came up with in the original 70s Galactica, which there was enough spin when they did that it kind of gave it a different world type feel to it. When I look back at the 70s series, I really enjoy a lot of the story. And I guess, is it okay now to talk about some of the speculation story-wise?
Oh, yes, feel free.
Okay, so there potentially is spoilers galore here, and I'm pursuing the old man's piecing together of stuff. So I did not read any of the novels. If anybody has any extra information about this, please share, because I've been curious about this for decades now. So if you've got a definitive answer, I'd like to know. The first thing is to point out that at the end of The Living Legend, Kane was taking on those 3 base ships. And the last you saw of that was just like a big explosion with dots all over, and we weren't sure if the Pegasus actually survived. And so Sheba and a lot of the Pegasus crew were back on the Galactica. In fact, Adama and Sheba had a conversation, and Adama's like, well, you can stay here and we'll be your family till we find your father again, because your father's just not one to give up. And I don't think Kane did die. I don't think he died at all, because there was some interesting dialogue that was presented there. So the first thing is when they found Count Ibley, when they found him on this planet, I think it was Apollo stated there was a giant crater on this planet. And he said it was the size of a Battlestar. And then throughout that episode, they were kind of kept away from that planet. But then at the end of the 2-part episode, they went back to the planet. And there was like this area. I don't know if it was part of the ship or it was an escape pod. And Starbuck and Apollo were stopping initially Sheba from looking inside of there. And then I don't know if she ever got to look at the end there. But I think, and let's go back a little bit more into the War of the Gods episode, there was this weird thing going on between Ibley and Sheba. And Sheba even mentioned, it was phrased like, you remind me a lot of my father. And Count Ibley said in return, how very perceptive of you. I think what happened is after Kane and the Pegasus crew that was remaining on the ship, they survived that skirmish with the base ships. And I think they encountered Count Ibley. And I think Count Ibley tapped into Kane's darker side because Adama rejected Count Ibley and his questionable ideas about things. I think Ibley tapped into Kane. And I think that Kane was tricked into either fighting or trying to fight those ships of light, or Kane eventually found out what Ibley was and tried to fight Ibley, and then Ibley crashed that Battlestar Pegasus onto that planet and killed everybody. Now that's speculation. I'm piecing stuff together here. I think there's enough evidence to point to the fact that I think Kane did survive. I think Ibley and Kane eventually fought each other. And I think Ibley absorbed a lot of what Kane was. Hence why when Sheba said, "You remind me a lot of my father. How perceptive of you." I think that's what that was about. And I think that was Kane's dead body inside that piece of the ship that Apollo and Starbuck were stopping Sheba from looking at. Although to give Starbuck credit, he's the one who told Apollo, yeah, maybe she should look at that. Now, I explained this theory to Molly, and I was curious, Molly, do you think that that's completely harebrained, or do you think there's something there to at least think about?
Oh, I think definitely that was heavily implied that it was Commander Kane that was in that wreckage.
And what was interesting was, again, I don't remember the exact wording, but one of them, Starbuck or Apollo, said, and it looks like whatever this ship was like hit by a sun. And I thought that was a very interesting wording too, or a star. Maybe sun or a star, but essentially means the same thing. So apparently the Pegasus was fighting something, if we go with this theory. It was either fighting those beings of light, which when we know what those things are, I don't know if that would happen unless Kane completely sided with Ibley, or if Ibley unleashed his full force upon Kane and the Pegasus and destroyed the ship himself.
Yeah, because in that one episode, we did learn that Ibley was one of those, we learned that he was one of those beings of light.
Essentially a fallen angel.
Yes, exactly where I was going with that. So he would have the same powers that they had. He was just using his differently than they were. So it would stand to reason that he would have the ability to basically use a star or a sun to...
or maybe he himself emanates so much energy that he was able to just fry a Battlestar.
Yeah, exactly. So I think he could have done that himself.
And that's the thing, too, is although they did have the concept of angels in this, Adama even mentioned in the 70s series, when talking about this, he was basically doing what Star Trek normally was good for, saying, well, these are just advanced creatures, well beyond our ability to understand. But Adama never placed them at the same level as like a god, or a god in this case. So I thought that was interesting too, because when you compare that to what Galactica Reboot did with Starbuck, and made her this pseudo-ghost angel thing that was supernatural. In the 70s, Adama was basically saying, well, they may look like angels to us, but they're just really advanced creatures. And so what was interesting is they kind of set the light entities as kind of like the custodians of the universe, and this fallen angel was going around and interfering with stuff, and they allowed that to happen as long as he could convince the entity that Ibley was trying to control to like submit to his will voluntarily. But as soon as he didn't get permission and started meddling, that's when they took over and would try to enforce their rules upon Ibley. That story I enjoyed quite a lot because I thought it went very well with the living legend, because once I figured out that I'm pretty sure that was Kane that they encountered on that planet, and that's why Ibley, when they picked him up, it was on the planet that the Pegasus crashed into that crater. Those two-part things, those 4 episodes total, to me fit together quite nicely. And so I enjoyed that quite a bit. Now, to go back to Count Ibley, so this is another thing that This one I'm less sure about what the answer is. But when Count Iblis forced Baltar to be captured by the Galactica, and he visited Baltar in the brig, and Baltar mentioned that I've heard that voice before. I've heard it from the Imperious Leader. We've heard that Imperious Leader voice in the pilot, as well as in maybe 1 or 2 other episodes. And it is Patrick Macnee. And so the question is, Baltar mentioned that the Imperious Leader was constructed originally, what was it, 1,000 yarns ago? Or it was several, thousands of yarns ago, whatever it was. But I think that might have been patterned after Iblis.
I believe it was established that the Imperious Leader, that his voice was given to him by his creator, that it was his creator's voice. And it does make you wonder, did Count Iblis, was he responsible for that reptilian race creating the Cylons?
And was he influencing that reptilian race to do that, which was going to be a self-destructive path?
Oh, yes, because they went extinct and the Cylons still exist.
And then the Cylons were unleashed upon the universe, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
And was that all at Count Iblis' doing? If one starts factoring in that larger story, it makes one wonder if what could have been in this Galactica had been allowed to continue. Because it makes one wonder if this whole Cylon trying to exterminate the human race war, when you trace it back, if it was all Count Iblis, the fallen angel, that started the whole thing and manipulated those reptilians to create the Cylons, which he knew were going to turn on them, and that he knew eventually would be the instrument of humans' downfall in the galaxy. Now, that's a theory of mine. Again, I haven't read the novels, so anybody who has more information about this, feel free to share. But I have a feeling that Count Iblis was supposed to be more in this series than what he was. Because even the beginning of the episodes where you hear that narrator going, life here began out there with tribes of humans who may have been the... That's Patrick Macnee again. And yeah, you could say, well, he has a nice voice. They hired him for that. Well, right, he did. But maybe that was more significant as he's narrating that, like in an authoritative, almost an omniscient way of describing what's happening. Maybe this whole Iblis thing and the fallen angels had more to do with this series than we're giving it credit for, because it never got to finish what it was trying to tell. So anyway, that's the old man's theory. Molly at least is not rolling her eyes at what I'm saying, so she must be on board with some of what I'm saying.
The pieces are definitely there that it could have gone that way, yeah.
So I'm curious, those of you who might be a bit thicker in the lore, especially those who read the novels, is any of that fleshed out there? Do they talk about Iblis or Cain anymore? And do they give any indications that maybe I'm on the right path? Because I think that's a really cool idea if that would have been the way it was going down. Because, like I said, the Living Legend and the War of the Gods are like, those are two of the episode pairs that I recommend. There's other stuff in the series that I'd recommend too if I wanted to say there's a little bit of this. Because like one of the episodes, you find out that Starbuck thought that this guy, he found out that this guy might be his father. And so you found a bit more about Starbuck's history. And I think the father was portrayed by Fred Astaire. And there were little things like this that kind of helped flesh out the character of Starbuck a bit more. And that's why I don't understand. Kara Thrace has absolutely nothing in common with what Starbuck was in the 70s series. They flew Vipers, and they smoked cigars, played Pyramid. I think that's the name of the game they were playing, the poker game. But as far as personalities go, I can't imagine Starbuck 1970s punching Colonel Ty, even if Ty was lipping off.
No, there's no way he would have done that.
I'm not sure I have much more to say here, because I could go into the individual episodes of what I liked. The Lost Planet of the Gods, that pairing had to do with finding Kobol and getting a direction to head toward Earth. and meeting up with Baltar, like right after he sold out the human race and how that went down. And there was a lot of interesting confrontation, we'll say, between Lucifer and Baltar. And it wasn't always clear. The plan was on the Cylons then that Baltar was going to trick the humans to fly into Cylon territory and be taken over by the Cylons. But it was never clear if Baltar was trying to actually connive with Adama to actually take over the Cylons. Like, at least for me, I don't think it was clear how that plan was supposed to go down. And even Lucifer was questioning with one of the Centurions about, well, who was supposed to be whose prisoner at that point. So that was a good episode. And that had to do with the Viper pilots who were all male at that point because they hadn't met the Pegasus yet in Sheba. And they all fell sick. So they had to train up the shuttle pilots to become Viper pilots. And most of them were women. So that's how Athena became a Viper pilot and Serena became a Viper pilot. And a bit of a spoiler here, but that's also how Serena died when she died on Kobol and made Boxy essentially an orphan until Apollo took him in as a stepson. That's a good episode just for seeing Kobol and kind of filling in the mythology of how to head to Earth. Lots of good stuff in this, at least I think so. If I had to pick a series to recommend of the two, the rebooted one or the 70s one, without a question, I would recommend the 70s one. They do recycle a bit of outside battle footage because they were on a limited budget, but the story makes up for that. And the footage they do show is really well done. It just happens to be recycled as the series goes on.
And it was done, I believe, by the same studio that did the ships and the battles for Star Wars. So what they do have was actually really, really outstanding.
1978 television.
Yeah.
That's the part, yeah, it's hard to wrap your head around because now with desktop publishing, you can see TV shows that have decent visual effects. These were models. These were old school models being done in 1978 for a television show. And they look that good. I'm blown away by that. But that's just me. Obviously, I think we are both recommending this 70s Galactica series extremely highly. It is a military sci-fi show, but like I mentioned with the Iblis stuff, there's more to it than just military sci-fi. They actually do have some interesting existential questions that are brought up. So there's more here than just military sci-fi, which is usually how this series is sold. And yeah, Rebooted Galactica introduced that concept of the gods of the Cylon, the god of the Cylon, singular god. But like Molly was mentioning a little bit ago, even though Ronald D. Moore was using the term god, did he actually respect the concept of what that means? Because I don't know. I mean, I can't say for sure no, but just the way he treated the material compared to the original, I just question that sometimes.
It certainly didn't look like it to me. Especially since it was the Cylons and their new religion that made them so dangerous. And given that this was a very early post 9/11 show, it just makes me question what the intention was there and what he was trying to demonstrate. And it didn't work for me. I didn't like it at all. Like I said, I much prefer the original 1978 show. And like Dirk Benedict pointed out, that was actually a hopeful show, whereas the reboot was not. And as I've said before, with the reboot, I think the only thing worth watching is the miniseries that kicked off the whole thing. But I would not watch anything after that ever again. Well, it was just horrible.
Even the hopeful stuff when Sheba and Starbuck and Apollo and Bojay were going on some mission to take out the air defenses of that fuel depot. And Sheba was essentially saying, well, this is a one-way mission. And Starbuck immediately said, yeah, this guy doesn't go on one-way missions. And then he was explaining how he was going to look at this. It's going to be a quick mission, in and out. And Sheba was like, I see what you're saying. You're an optimist, aren't you? And that sort of thing was prevalent through this whole 70s series. And in the reboot, it was the exact opposite. It got more depressing as the show went on. it just got really depressing to the point where, other than somebody who just likes wallowing in their own dark places, I don't understand why anybody would watch the mid to tail end of the rebooted Galactica series. Not only was it nonsensical, but it just was so dark and depressing. You got to see horrible human beings at their worst. I just don't understand why anybody would want to do that. And like I said, you compare the two Kanes, Admiral Kane with Commander Kane, and it's night and day. A brilliant tactician who still saw himself as protector of civilians, and then Admiral Kane, a piece of human garbage.
That pretty much sums up the difference, between the two shows. That right there, I think, is the easiest demonstration of what went wrong with the reboot. Boy, what a dark thing that was.
And I guess on that, maybe we should just call it a day. Say, if you can find the definitive Blu-ray for Battlestar Galactica 1978, highly recommend. Watch the 4:3 aspect ratio. If all you can get is the 16:9 or the theatrical, it's better than nothing. But I strongly recommend the Blu-ray definitive edition 4:3 ratio.
It had positive male role models, lots of them actually, and a lot of positive, strong female characters as well. There were no Mary Sues to be found. There was good, there was bad, but there was no disgusting evil like Ronald D. Moore's Galactica as far as the main characters on the good side went.
Count Ibley, that was the bad guy.
Well, and the Cylons and Baltar, but it wasn't like where everybody was this moral relativism, and like you said, by the end, they all appeared to be just awful people.
Plus, in the original pilot, when they were hoarding that food, which is something they absolutely would do that kind of crap in rebooted Galactica, Apollo would not tolerate that, and Adama wouldn't tolerate that. And that's exactly the type of messaging where, no, just because your world is collapsing around you, we do not give up our morals on who we are. And rebooted Galactica wanted to take on when the world's around you collapsing, you just have to find a way to relook at things, and all of a sudden what used to be considered bad may not be so bad anymore. Well, I'm not on board with that. I'm just not. And if you are, great. I want you to be the happiest person you can be. Although watching that stuff, I don't know how you can be happy, but that's none of my business. It's not that I enjoy watching 1970s or 80s production values or 90s. It's that at least the optimism is there. And I'm not going to watch this dark, oh my God, there's no hope for anything. We live in this dark, relativistic world. Maybe I can live with killing 3 people because, I explained to myself how killing 3 people is not so bad. The circumstances made it so it was okay. Again, going back to that Strange New Worlds where Dr. Mbenga killed that Klingon ambassador, and unless they do something this season to address that, he's just going to get away with that. And the real butcher was actually the doctor to begin with, not this Klingon. And there are people that I'm sure online are defending Dr. Mbenga the way they set him up. Not to mention that's character smearing, a one-off that was in TOS. But it doesn't matter. You can smear whatever you want. You can smear Dr. Mbenga. You can smear Commander Kane. You can smear Colonel Ty. You can smear Boomer. It doesn't matter. You can just smear all these characters. It doesn't matter. I got Easter eggs. I got the Stu Phillips Battlestar Galactica music playing at the museum. See? We got Cassiopeia's red dress on 6. See? We're respecting the original.
No more reboots. I refuse to watch another reboot. No more. Because all they do is destroy things that used to be good. So I'm not going to do it anymore. I'm not going to watch any more reboots.
They never get the essence of what the show was originally right.
No.
I'm trying to think of a reboot that actually was at least as good as the original.
Good luck with that.
I mean, I'm sure somebody in the comments might be able to share that with us, but I can't think of any that come to mind because it's always a lesser version of it. I mean,
maybe 2005 Doctor Who?
Maybe.
Different show, definitely, but at least at the time, Russell Davies wasn't showing all the kids the darkness of the world like he is now.
Well, remember the Eccleston character, again, that was a Moffat-written story, but the Just This One Time, Everybody Lives.
Yeah.
Even though the cinematography in that episode, it was dark and it was set in a very bad time in World War II British history, and the Doctor was still trying to see a positive thing at that point.
Well, and like Rose told the girl in the episode, they won. You know, it may not look like it right then, but there is a future, and they win. And so it was bringing hope, not only, you know, in that everybody lived in the episode, but in telling that girl in the episode that, yes, there is a future. We get through this, and we thrive. So there was a positive message there. Unlike the shit we get now, which is basically everything is horrible. Everybody's horrible, so you can basically be as horrible as you want as long as you can justify it.
As long as you're slightly less horrible than that horrible person, then it's okay to be horrible.
Yeah.
That's why Molly and I watch a lot of older stuff again. Because every once in a while, we need some positive messaging. The 70s Galactica did talk about a post-apocalyptic, but it brought the group together. And the one dark side of it was, like I said, when Kane was basically unleashed with Adama's blessing to go take on those 3 base ships. That was like the best way to handle, yeah, we've reached this point, but we're going to get one victory here, and we're going to let this overly enthused military genius give us our one victory, and that's what he gave them. And that's the kind of positive optimism that I want.
Well, that being said, you know, like I said, I totally recommend watching the 1978 Galactica. Personally, I actually enjoyed Galactica 1980.
Boo.
Yeah, it was a dumbed down version of the original, but I enjoyed watching it mostly because there was still a little bit to hang on to as far as...
It had Wolfman Jack in it.
I know. Well, that episode, it was a Halloween episode, and honestly, it was funny. So, I laughed at a lot of stuff in that show.
All right, for laughing, I even said, for laughing...
Yes, you did.
1980, if you want to see like a comedic parody of Battlestar Galactica, I don't think it was mean-spirited, it just was incredibly stupid.
Yes, exactly. So, you know, it was innocuous when it comes to a continuation of the story, especially when compared to the reboot.
And the definitive collection Blu-ray set, you should get Galactica 1980 as part of that.
Yeah. And also, like I said, you know, if you want me to make a video on what Dirk Benedict said in his Lost in Castration, let me know in the comments below. If I get enough interest, I will go ahead and make a video on that. Otherwise, I guess that's all I've got to say about that.
Until next time.
Take care.